Nachmu nachamu ami yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu nachamu ami yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu ami yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu ami yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu abi yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu abi yoimar Elokeichem. Nachmu ami yoimar
Nachamu by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from his album Likrat Shabbat. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's with us on a Tuesday night? Yehud in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in Great Neck, Nancy, North Carolina, Paul in Chicago, Renee in Indiana, Bella in Venice. Welcome, Bella, from Venice today. PK in Colorado, Celsa in Pasadena, Texas, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Harold in Portland, David in Indiana, Hannah in New York, Renee. Comfort, comfort my people, right from the Haftorah from Isaiah, right? Or is it Jeremiah? Maybe it's Jeremiah. Shandora from the Bronx, Karen in Northern California, Paula in the Great Northwest, Yosef in Massachusetts, and Clarice says, good evening, and Paula says, shalom, my friends. And over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida and Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Another big page. Let's get right into it. Today's daf is page 14, here in the 14th volume of the Talmud, tractate Yevamos. These are the laws of yibum, right? Yibum, a Torah-mandated command that if a man dies childless and married, and he has a surviving brother, that the brother should marry the widow. And the first child of that union will be considered the heir of the brother who died without a child. Alternatively, they can perform chalitzah, a ceremony in which they are released from that bond, the yibum bond. We are actually now in the second Mishna. We finally reached the second Mishna. And in the second Mishna, like the first, we looked at wives who have some kind of relationship with the Yavam, right? So the widow is called the Yevama. The surviving brother is the Yavam. When the Yevama has a very strong familial relationship with the Yavam that precludes her from marrying him, then they are released from each other. There is no yibum or chalitzah, and the Yevama's co-wife, who doesn't have such a familiar relationship with the Yavam, is also released from both yibum or chalitzah. Here in Mishnah number 2, we cover 6 women whose relationships are even tighter to the Yavam than the relationships covered in the first Mishnah. And because it's such a close relationship, not only is yibum and chalitza not even a possibility, but because it's such not a possibility, there the co-wife is not exempted. The co-wife does come before the Yavam for yibum or chalitza. But in exploring this second Mishnah, we see that Beis Hillel would exempt, as we learned, we exempted the co-wives in Mishnah number 1, but now we learn that Beis Shammai, did not exempt the co-wives, that the co-wives should still come before the Yavam for yibum or chalitza according to Beis Shammai. And so now we're continuing to explore this dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. We picked this up about 2/3 of the way down on 13b. The Mishnah taught, if any of the rival wives, co-wives of the brother the one who died, performed chalitza, Beis Shammai disqualify her from marrying into the priesthood, meaning that the chalitza that this co-wife performed was a valid chalitza, and a woman who has performed chalitza is likened to a divorcee, and therefore, I'm very annoyed by these people who come on our live feed and try to rip off our guests. Nina will ban this idiot, who's like addressing a bunch of people and wants to get to know you. I'm sorry that there's so many scammers on Facebook. We ban them from the page as soon as we find them. At any rate, so Beis Shammai were saying that the chalitzah that was performed was a valid chalitzah because the co-wife remained obligated in the yibum bond or chalitzah alternative. Therefore, if that co-wife performed a chalitzah, it's a valid chalitzah. She's like a woman who is a divorcee, and kohanim, priests, are not allowed to marry a divorced woman and continue to serve in the Holy Temple as Kohanim, right? So that is a valid chalitzah, which leads to a divorce-like status, and the woman cannot marry a priest. On the other hand, Beis Hillel say that the co-wife was exempt from yibum and chalitzah. Therefore, if she performed a chalitzah with the yavam, it's as if they did nothing, and that woman remains able to marry a priest. She can't marry the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, because the Kohen Gadol can only marry a woman who was neither married nor widowed, certainly not divorced. But a regular priest can't marry a divorcee, but may marry a widow. The Gemara answers. The statement, the Mishnah taught, if any of the rival wives of the brother perform chalitzah, Beis Shammai disqualify her from marrying into the priesthood, as they hold that the chalitzah was valid. Now the Gemara asks, if the rival wives are obligated in the mitzvah of yibum and they perform chalitzah, it is obvious that the status of the woman who had undergone chalitzah applies to them. And the Gemara answers, this statement comes to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who said, come and let us institute for rival wives of women with whom relations are forbidden, that they should perform chalitzah and not enter into yibum. Right, so Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri had a different approach than Beis Hillel had. Beis Hillel said, and our first Mishnah holds, and it is the law, that if one wife is exempt from yibum or chalitzah because she has a prohibited relationship with the yavam, then the co-wife, even though she doesn't have such a relationship with the yavam, is exempt, fully exempt from yibum and chalitzah, and performs neither. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, let the co-wife be prohibited to marry the yavam, prohibited to perform yibum with the yavam, but instead let her just perform chalitzah. It's going to end up the same result, right? They're not going to get married, so why not perform chalitzah? But as we've seen, it does have a consequence that such a woman would not be permitted to marry a priest. Nevertheless, this explanation comes to exclude that opinion. That they should perform chalitzah and not enter into yibum. Now, if this ordinance were accepted, these co-wives would be disqualified by rabbinic law, even according to the opinion of Beis Hillel. And the Mishnah therefore teaches us that Beis Hillel deemed the rival wives fully fit to marry into the priesthood, as no chalitzah was instituted for co-wives, and any chalitzah performed with them is entirely meaningless. The Mishnah further taught, if they entered into yibum, Beis Shammai deemed them fit for the priesthood, and Beis Hillel disqualified them. And the Gemara asks, why do I need this as well? As the law follows logically from the previous statement concerning chalitzah. They're disqualified from chalitzah or yibum according to Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai say the co-wives are qualified to perform either chalitzah or yibum. So if they did perform the yibum and later were widowed, Beis Hillel disqualified them because they weren't fit to perform yibum. So if they performed yibum, meaning basically they had marital relations with the brother-in-law, permitted according to Beis Shammai, even encouraged, but prohibited, absolutely prohibited according to Beis Hillel, and therefore the woman basically had illicit sexual relations with her brother-in-law because the prohibition on being with your brother's wife would still apply. But that seems obvious from this flow. So the Gemara asks, why do I need this as well? This law follows logically from the previous statement concerning chalitzah. And the Gemara answers that since the Mishnah taught performed chalitzah, it also taught the case of entered into yibum, despite the fact that this was not necessary, as even without this ruling the matter would have been understood. But the Baraisa, was it the Baraisa? The Mishnah that we're studying, Mishnah number 2, was just being complete and establishing both cases. Apropos, the Mishnah's comments concerning the details of the relationship between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, which said in the Mishnah that even though Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai disagreed on the status of the co-wives when one of the Yevamos is disqualified from yibum or chalitzah, which would lead to a situation where, according to Beis Shammai, a woman did what was perfectly right and proper in marrying her Yavam, but according to Beis Hillel, she would have committed a big avera, a big transgression. Nevertheless, despite that their divergence in this matter of law, the people, the followers of Hillel and the followers of Shammai would nevertheless, marry off their children to each other and borrow and share utensils with each other. They kept up the collegiality and civility and friendship even with people that disagreed with them on a very important matter. So apropos, the Mishnah's comments concerning this relationship between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the Gemara discusses the issue of disputes in general. Now, this part is fascinating. Hold on to your seats. We learned in a Mishnah there in Tractate Megillah, right, which we covered, right, Tractate Megillah, about the laws of reading the Megillah and other observances of Purim. And we learned that it's the first Mishnah on page 2a, that the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, is read on the 11th of Adar, on the 12th, on the 13th, on the 14th, or on the 15th in cities surrounded by a wall, no earlier and no later than this. The obligation to read the Megillah on the 14th or 15th of Adar is stated in the Megillah itself, while the additional days that you could do it on the 11th, 12th, or 13th were instituted by the sages. We read about this, remember, to allow residents of villages who would come to the cities on Mondays and Thursdays, the market days, and supply water and rations to the residents of the cities, that they should hear the reading of the Megillah at that opportunity when they wouldn't have, such a nice festive opportunity to do it in their own small villages. So the sages decreed you could fulfill your obligation to hear the Megillah on Purim even a few days ahead of Purim, in that situation where you lived in a small village and were in the city on Monday or Thursday prior to Purim. Now, with respect to that ruling, Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, I should read here the verse, you shall not cut yourself. You shall not cut yourselves. Tit godedu, right? Tit godedu. That's Deuteronomy 14:1. Now, you shall not cut yourselves is a negative commandment, meaning that you will not adopt the practices of the non-Jews who live around you at the time the Torah was given, and who, in their idolatrous practices, would have a ritual where to mourn a dead relative or a beloved dead person, they would cut themselves, right? They would gash themselves. They would cut their skin. And so it's prohibited, absolutely prohibited for a Jew to do that, cut themselves for the dead. But here, Reish Lakish is making a very colorful and interesting interpretation of that command, that negative command, you shall not cut yourselves, which is interpreted as meaning, do not cut yourselves as a people into numerous factions that have different observances, different Jewish observances from each other. In other words, you should be a unified people that follow the Torah in the same way. In other words, the Jewish people should be united rather than divided into disparate groups that act in different ways. And before analyzing this issue, the Gemara asks, this verse, you shall not cut yourselves, it is required for the matter itself, as the merciful one is saying, do not cut yourselves over the dead. How is the law concerning factions among the Jewish people with respect to various observances of Torah derived from the seemingly straightforward command in the Torah, do not cut yourselves over the dead? And the Gemara answers, if so, that the verse comes to teach only about the practices of mourning, let the verse state only, you shall not cut. What is the meaning of you shall not cut yourselves? learn from this that it comes for this purpose as well, to teach the prohibition against splitting into factions. And the Gemara asks, but in that case, one can say that the entire verse comes for this purpose and does not refer to cutting for the dead at all. And the Gemara answers, well, if so, let the verse state, lo tagodu, rather than lo titgodedu, both of which mean you shall not cut. What is the meaning of lo titgodedu? Conclude two conclusions from it. Both the simple prohibition against making cuts for the dead and the matter of becoming divided into factions. Now, after this incidental discussion, the Gemara returns to the basic question raised by Reish Lakish. Why doesn't the reading of the scroll of Esther in different places at different times violate the prohibition against breaking into factions, right? These residents of the small villages who have a market day in the city, and they're going to be hearing the Megillah, 1, 2, or 3 days before Purim, but everyone else who lives in that city, they're going to be hearing the Megillah on Purim, on the 14th of Adar, unless they live in a walled city that was walled at the time that Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land, in which case they're going to hear the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. So if we have a prohibition against becoming a factionalized, balkanized people who have, very different practices and ways of observing the holidays, so then why doesn't that apply here to reading the Megillah on various days where everyone, is going to be reading the Megillah on one of 5 different days? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, have you not taught until now in a place where the people are accustomed to perform labor on Passover Eve, Erev Pesach, the afternoon, the day before Passover begins that night, that in a place where people are accustomed to perform labor on Erev Pesach until noon, one may do so on that day. But in a place where the people were accustomed not to perform labor at all on that day, one may not do so. Well, this shows that different places can have different customs without violating the prohibition against dividing into factions. Now, Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, I speak to you of a prohibition, as residents of villages are prohibited from reading the Megillah with a blessing on the 15th of Adar. If they read the Megillah on the wrong day, they might hear the Megillah, but they're not performing the mitzvah, and therefore they can't say the blessing over performing the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah. As Rav Shemin bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, the verse in Esther 9:31, to confirm these days of Purim in their appointed times, teaches that the sages instituted many times for their reading, and it is prohibited to deviate from these dates. And you speak to me about a custom that does not involve a prohibition. It doesn't say in the Torah that you can't work on the day before Passover. It's a minhag. It's a custom that in some places they don't work, in other places they do, but it's only by custom. There's no commandment associated with working or not working in the morning of the day before Passover. Whereas there is a commandment in the book of Esther to celebrate and hear the Megillah on Purim. For most people on the 14th, and then on the 15th for people who live in walled cities. But this thing that the rabbis came along and said, well, you could hear the Megillah on the 11th or the 12th or the 13th of Adar. How does that not factionalize the Jewish people? And Rabbi Yochanan replied, and in that case there, on Passover Eve, the day before Passover, is there no prohibition involved? But didn't we learn in a Mishna? On the night before the 14th of Nisan, Beis Shammai prohibit the performance of work, and Beis Hillel permit it. Evidently, there is indeed a prohibition involved, and yet some perform work while others do not, which splits the people into factions. Reish Lakish said to him, in that case there, the different factions are not noticeable, as one who sees another who's not doing anything, he's not working, says to himself, well, he must have no work to do. It's not that he's prohibited from working. It's not that he's following a commandment and refraining from working because of the commandment. He's just not doing anything. Wait a minute. Therefore, refraining from work does not create the appearance of the people breaking into factions. Rabbi Yochanan raises a difficulty. But Beis Shammai permit rival wives to the brothers, and Beis Hillel prohibit this practice. Now we're back to the discussion at hand. This seems to be a factionalizing of the Jewish people, that all the followers of Shammai allow the co-wives to marry the Yavam, and Beis Hillel, whom the law follows, do not allow the co-wife to marry the Yavam. Now that really seems like factionalizing the Jewish people. This is an example of a clear prohibition, and yet two different traditions were followed. Now we're on 14a. So Reish Lakish said to Rabbi Yochanan, do you hold that Beis Shammai actually acted in accordance with their own statement? Beis Shammai did not, in fact, act in accordance with their own statement, as the dispute was merely theoretical. Beis Shammai said, no. The co-wife, halachically speaking, must be allowed to perform yibum or chalitzah with the Yavam. But since the law follows Beis Hillel, even though we disagree with you, we're going to obey the law that has become the normative halacha for the whole Jewish people. So according to Reish Lakish, there was no faction since Beis Shammai disagreed with it, but followed the law. And Rabbi Yochanan said, now Rabbi Yochanan answers Reish Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan said, Beis Shammai certainly did act in accordance with their opinion. No, it's not that they disagreed and then followed the law the same as everyone else. No. They had a different opinion and they followed their own opinion. And the Gemara comments, and this is also reflected in the dispute between Rav and Shmuel. As Rav says, Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their own statement, and Shmuel said they certainly did act in accordance with their statement. So the Gemara inquires, well, when does this question apply? If we say that it is referring to the period prior to the Bas Kol, the divine voice that emerged from heaven, which declared that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, right, which we've seen that there was, we learned this on Eruvin, page 13, that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai dispute many things for many years. And then a voice from heaven emerged and said, these and these are the words of the living Torah, but the law follows Beis Hillel because they are easy and forbearing, and they state the opinions of their opponents before their own, from which we learn many laws of civil discourse. So at any rate, are we talking about when there was a dispute between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai before the divine voice came and said that the law follows Beis Hillel, or after that event? If we say that it is referring to the period prior to the divine voice that declared that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, then what is the rationale of the one who said that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinion? But rather, if they must have acted according to their own opinion prior to the Bas Kol saying, no, the law follows Beis Hillel. But rather, if one would say that this dispute is referring to a time after the divine voice came and established the law according to Beis Hillel, then what is the reason for the one who said that they did not act in accordance with their opinion? After all, the divine voice established that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. And the people of Beis Shammai were obviously observant, faithful Jews who, once the law was established according to Beis Hillel, even if they disagreed with it, they followed the law. Now the Gemara answers, neither of these options poses a difficulty. La kasha, it is not difficult. If you wish, say that this dispute is referring to the period prior to the divine voice establishing the law according to Beis Hillel, and if you wish, say instead that it is after that event. And the Gemara explains, if you wish, say it is prior to the divine voice, and it is referring to the period when Beis Hillel formed the majority of the sages. Even when that dispute existed, it wasn't a 50-50 split. There were always more people following Beis Hillel than Beis Shammai. Therefore, according to the one who said that, if you were to say it was prior to the divine voice, it is referring to the period when Beis Hillel formed the majority of the sages. Therefore, according to the one who said that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinion, the reason is that Beis Hillel was the majority, and the law is in accordance with the majority. In the absence of a divine voice coming out and telling us whose opinion we should follow, we follow the majority. Not the majority of the Jewish people, but the majority of the sages who we obey in every generation. The law has been established for, many centuries, so we don't really need to follow the majority on most issues. But when we're not sure, yes, you take it to the Gedolim, right? The leading sages of the generation. They discuss amongst themselves, and then they vote, and we follow the majority of their opinion. And the one who said that they did act in accordance with their opinion, maintains that when do we follow the majority? It is in a case where the disputing parties are equal in wisdom to one another. Here, however, Beis Shammai are sharper than Beis Hillel. Correct. We actually have a tradition that Beis Shammai were actually smarter, that their prowess in following arguments through to their conclusion was sharper than Beis Hillel. They were greater in wisdom than Beis Hillel. Why do we follow Beis Hillel? Because they were easy and forgiving and forbearing, and they stated the opinions of their opponents before their own. See how valuable those traits are. Here, however, Beis Shammai are sharper than Beis Hillel, and therefore they acted in accordance with their own opinion, despite the fact that they were in the minority. And if you wish, say instead that the dispute concerns the period after the Bas Kol, after the divine voice came and established the law according to Beis Hillel. And the one who said that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their opinion would say that this was due to the pronouncement of the Bas Kol, the divine voice. And the one who said that they did so, that they did act in accordance with their own opinions, even though a Bas Kol said that the law is according to Beis Hillel, why would Beis Shammai not listen to a divine voice? Why? This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, who said, with regard to the divine voice that emerged and proclaimed that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer in the famous case of the oven of Achnai, in the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer, who said it was kosher, and all the other rabbis who said that oven was not kosher, that we don't listen to a Bas Kol. The law was given to Jews on earth. It is not in heaven. It is here on earth. And on earth, we don't listen to divine voices. We follow the majority, right? So interesting that they're going to cite, we don't follow a Bas Kol to say we're going to do our own thing, because the teaching there was, we don't follow a Bas Kol, we follow the majority. That's interesting there. But they're just stopping at the first part of that ruling. One disregards a heavenly voice. So just as he disregarded the divine voice in his dispute with Rabbi Eliezer, so too one disregards the divine voice that proclaimed that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel. And the question remains, according to the one who said that Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their own opinion, we should read here, you shall not cut yourselves into factions. And so how can we have that Beis Shammai is following their own opinion, is permitting these marriages that Beis Hillel prohibits? Doesn't that really factionalize the Jewish people? How do we explain that? Abaye said, when we say that the prohibition, you shall not cut yourselves, applies, we are referring to a case where two courts are located in one city. And these rule in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai, and those rule in accordance with the statement of Beis Hillel. You can't have two rabbinic courts in the same city that are going to give different rulings because they have a different judicial philosophy, as it were, a different interpretation of the Torah. That would lead people to forum shop, right? As it were, they would go to the court where they're going to get the ruling that they're looking for. That is not an okay state of affairs. However, with regard to two courts located in two different cities, we have no problem with it. Okay, there can be regional differences. That's not going to factionalize the Jewish people. Rava said to him, to Abaye, but the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is considered like a case of two courts in one city, as these two schools of thought were found everywhere, not in any specific place. There were followers of Shammai and followers of Hillel in every city. Rather, Rava said, when we say that the prohibition, you shall not cut yourselves, applies, we are referring to a case where there is a court in one city, a section of which rules in accordance with the statement of Beis Shammai, and the other section of that same court rules in accordance with the statement of Beis Hillel. However, with regard to two courts located in one city, we have no problem with it. Okay, you can forum shop within a city. What we can have is a divided court where they have two different systems of thought within the same court. Now, the Gemara cites other relevant sources that are going to help us work out how could it be that there was a period when Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed on whether something was a permitted or prohibited marriage, which would lead the ones who said it's a prohibited marriage, that children of that marriage are mamzerim, right? They're illegitimate children. Huge, huge issue. How could the people be factionalized in that way? So to answer this, we're going to bring in some other sources. Come and hear. Tashema, very common introduction to some new points being brought. Tashema, come and hear. In the locale of Rabbi Eliezer, where his ruling was followed, they would cut down trees on Shabbos to prepare charcoal for them to fashion iron tools with which to circumcise a child on Shabbos. You can make a bris on Shabbos, but if you didn't have a knife with which to make the circumcision on Shabbos, can you fabricate the knife? All of that, chopping trees, making coal, forging steel, hammering the steel, blacksmithing a knife, all of that is absolutely prohibited labors, but on Shabbos. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, if you don't have a knife with which to perform the circumcision on an eighth day that falls on Shabbos, so these are all part of the same process of performing the bris, which does override Shabbos. So he would allow those labors. In Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, not only does the mitzvah of circumcision override Shabbos, but also any action required for the preparation of the tools necessary for the circumcision, that also overrides Shabbos. And the Brisa adds, but in the locale of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, and also, here's another place that deviates from the rest of the Jewish people. In the locale where Rabbi Yosef HaGalili was the rabbinic authority, they would eat poultry meat in milk, as Rabbi Yosef HaGalili held that the prohibition of meat and milk together does not include poultry. I would have liked to live there, because before I became religious, I liked chicken parmesan. Since I became religious, I can't eat that. But if I lived in Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's locale, I could have eaten that. The Gemara infers, in the locale of Rabbi Eliezer, yes, they would act in this manner, whereas in the locale of Rabbi Akiva, no, they would not do so, as it is taught in a Baraisa that a principle was stated by Rabbi Akiva. Any prohibited labor that can be performed before Shabbos does not override Shabbos, even if it involves a mitzvah. You wanted to have a knife for the circumcision, you should have taken care of that before Shabbos. Now that you didn't make a knife before Shabbos, you can't make it on Shabbos. You're just going to delay the bris, the circumcision. A mitzvah whose proper time is on Shabbos overrides Shabbos only if its performance was impossible earlier. For example, the act of circumcision itself, which cannot be performed earlier. If you needed to boil water to sterilize the knife, that you could do on Shabbos because it's necessary. You couldn't have boiled that water before Shabbos and had it boiling on Shabbos when you need it. The Gemara asks, and what is this refutation? As stated above, it is different when dealing with numerous places, and the Baraisa explicitly states that this practice was followed in Rabbi Eliezer's locale. Consequently, there is no violation of the prohibition against splitting into factions. The Gemara asks, he who asked it, why did he ask it? I.e., what is the basis for the question in the first place? It is obvious that the Baraisa is referring to a specific place. And we're saying that having different rabbinic authorities over different cities and that they have some variations of Jewish law according to who is your local authority, that doesn't trigger a violation of this do not cut yourselves into various factions. So then why are you bringing it up? So the Gemara cites another relevant case involving Shabbos. Come in here, that Rabbi Abahu, when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, he would move an oil lamp, shiraga, after the flame that had been lit for that Shabbos had burned out, as Rabbi Yehoshua accepted the ruling that it is permitted to carry items of this sort that had been set aside. But when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yochanan, who prohibited carrying items of this kind that had been set aside on Shabbos, he would not move an oil lamp. And this indicates that divergent customs are followed in different places. And so the Gemara asks, and what is this difficulty? Didn't we say that it is different when dealing with numerous places? And the Gemara explains that this is what we are saying. With regard to Rabbi Abahu himself, how could he act in this manner here, and how could he act in that manner there? How could Rabbi Abahu, who feels that you can move this thing, but when he's over in that locale, he doesn't move it? What's going on? Is he being inconsistent? Like, is that somehow hypocritical? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Abahu holds, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, that it is permitted to carry this item. And when he happened to come to the place of Rabbi Yochanan, he would not carry it in deference to Rabbi Yochanan, so as not to act contrary to his ruling in a place where Rabbi Yochanan was the authority. And the Gemara asks, but there was a servant accompanying Rabbi Abahu who would see him carrying these types of articles that had been set aside. Wasn't Rabbi Abahu concerned that the servant might carry them in Rabbi Yochanan's locale? And the Gemara explains that he would inform the servant and explain to him the reason for his change of behavior. The Gemara continues to discuss the question of whether Beis Shammai followed their own rulings or not. Right? We're still back to this question. Beis Shammai say these marriages are permitted. Beis Hillel say prohibited. Was it theoretical or practical for Beis Shammai? Come in here that which is taught in the Mishna. Although Beis Hillel prohibit and Beis Shammai permit, excuse me, and Beis Shammai permit, and these disqualify the women, and those deem them fit, Beis Shammai did not refrain from marrying women from Beis Hillel, nor did Beis Hillel refrain from marrying women from Beis Shammai. Granted, if you say that Beis Shammai did not act in accordance with their own opinion, well, it is due to that reason that they did not have to refrain from marrying women from Beis Hillel. However, if you say that they did practically, as a practical matter, act in accordance with their own opinion, then why didn't they refrain from marrying one another? If according to one opinion, the children of such unions would be a mamzer, the child of such a union would be a mamzer, and according to the other opinion, it's perfectly legitimate, how could these groups intermarry? It's going to lead to terrible problems. And the Gemara elaborates. Granted, Beis Shammai did not refrain from marrying into Beis Hillel, as even if Beis Shammai maintains in a certain case that a rival wife required yibum or chalitzah, and if she went ahead and married another man, their children are born to a union whose partners are liable by a regular prohibition. The wife of the dead man shall not be married outside. Since this transgression does not entail charis, the children of this relationship are not mamzers, right? According to Beis Shammai, the rival wife, the co-wife, is obligated in yibum or chalitzah to the yavam. If, without performing chalitzah or yibum, she just goes and marries another man, right? According to Beis Shammai, she broke a bond that she had to the surviving brother, but what she broke is not a prohibition that entails a charis penalty. So even though she went and just, didn't deal with the yavam the way she should have, and then she just married some other man, the children of that union are definitely not considered mamzers, so it's not so bad. However, why did Beis Hillel not refrain from marrying into Beis Shammai? Now, in the opinion of Beis Hillel, the children of these co-wives who entered into yibum with their yavams, they are born of a union whose partners are liable to receive charis, as the prohibition of a brother's wife was never nullified in this case, which means that the children are mamzers. If so, how could Beis Hillel allow these marriages? And if you would say that Beis Hillel maintained that the child of a union whose partners are liable to receive charis is not a mamzer, as a mamzer is only one whose parents violated a prohibition that entails the death penalty, charis is death at the hands of the heavenly court. We don't know when or if, even if, it will eventually be applied. Maybe the person will, get out of it through other behavior. But if they do something like, commit incest, with a very close relative, that's a death penalty offense, meaning that if they were warned and did it anyway, they would be liable to a death penalty at the hands of an earthly court. And the child of that kind of a union is a mamzer for sure. All right, so where am I? So how could a death penalty? Right. Let me read it again. Any of you would say that Beis Hillel maintained that the child of a union whose partners are liable to receive kares is not a mamzer, because a mamzer only results from a union of parents who violated a prohibition that entails the death penalty. Well, didn't Rabbi Elazar say, although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed with regard to rival wives, they concede that a mamzer is only from a union whose prohibition is a prohibition of forbidden relations punishable by kares. Not the stiffer penalty of a death penalty at the hands of the earthly court, but kares. Consequently, the children of rival wives are mamzerim, according to Beis Hillel, according to this opinion of Rabbi Elazar. Rather, isn't it correct to conclude from here that Beis Shammai must have not acted in accordance with their own opinion, because if they did and they performed these unions that Beis Hillel consider unions that would produce a mamzer, then it would have been impossible for people from Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel to intermarry. And the Gemara rejects this conclusion. No, actually, Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their opinion. And as for the problem with these marriages, which didn't happen so often, but when it would happen that there was a marriage that would be okay according to Beis Shammai and prohibited according to Beis Hillel, in such a case, they would inform Beis Hillel. And Beis Hillel would withdraw from such a match so that there wouldn't be a problem. Now, when those who acted in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel would come to marry women from those who followed the rulings of Beis Shammai, they would be notified that certain children were born of rival wives who married their Yevamos, and that those people were considered mamzerim in the opinion of Beis Hillel, who therefore declared them forbidden in marriage, and so they wouldn't marry those women. But that comes up so infrequently that there was plenty of other women from, legitimate marriages according to both opinions that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai could intermarry. And the Gemara comments, and so too it is reasonable that this is the case, as the Mishna teaches in the latter clause, with regard to all the disputes concerning the laws of ritual purity and impurity, where those Beis Hillel rule an article ritually pure, and these Beis Shammai rule it ritually impure, they did not refrain from handling ritually pure objects, each with the other. 14b now. Granted, if you say that they notified them, it is due to that reason that they did not refrain from using each other's objects, because if there was a problem, they would be notified. However, if you say that they did not notify them, well, granted, it is logical that Beis Shammai did not refrain from handling items that belong to Beis Hillel, as ritually impure objects for Beis Hillel are ritually pure for Beis Shammai, and therefore no special care is necessary. However, why didn't Beis Hillel refrain from touching articles that belong to Beis Shammai? After all, ritually pure objects for Beis Shammai, there are some that are ritually impure for Beis Hillel, so why would Beis Hillel handle such objects? Rather, is it not the case that Beis Shammai notified Beis Hillel that these items were ritually pure only in their own opinion, but under your opinion they're not, so don't use this? And Beis Hillel separated themselves from those objects. And the Gemara summarizes the discussion, conclude from here that this is the correct interpretation. Where there was a problem, they notified each other so there wouldn't be a problem. And the Gemara asks, in what way is this case stronger than that case? In other words, why is the statement with regard to ritual purity and impurity more conclusive than the one that deals with marriage? Since the practice of notification was not explicitly stated in the case of ritual purity, but was merely inferred logically, so the same reasoning applies equally to the case of marriage. And the Gemara answers, well, lest you say that since it is so unusual, a marriage to a rival wife generates publicity and is so widely known that no special notification is required, therefore the Gemara teaches us that even in this case, notification is required. Now, since the statement of Rabbi Elazar was mentioned, the Gemara turns to discuss the matter itself. Rabbi Elazar said, although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed with regard to rival wives, they concede that a mamzer is only from a union whose prohibition is a prohibition of forbidden relations punishable by kares. So the Gemara asks, who concedes to whom? If we say that Beis Shammai concede to Beis Hillel, well, this is obvious, since if they acted in accordance with their own opinion that rival wives who married others without chalitzah are liable only for violating a regular prohibition, Their children are therefore fit and are not mamzerim at all. Rather, one could say that Beis Hillel conceded to Beis Shammai. But in that case, she herself, the rival wife of a forbidden relative who married one of the Yevamim, one of the surviving brothers, she is liable to receive kares in the opinion of Beis Hillel, and the child is a mamzer, whereas Rabbi Lazar's statement indicates that they concede with regard to a different case. The Gemara explains, actually, Beis Shammai concede to Beis Hillel, and this is not a novelty with regard to their basic dispute. Instead, the statement comes to exclude the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who said the offspring from forbidden relations for which one is liable for violating a prohibition is a mamzer. And Rabbi Lazar teaches us that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that the offspring from forbidden relations for which one is liable for violating a prohibition is not a mamzer. Rather, one is a mamzer only if he is born of a union punishable by kares. Now the Gemara returns to the initial question of whether or not Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their own opinion or not. We know that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagree on whether the co-wife of a woman prohibited to marry her Yevam is also exempt from yibum or chalitzah. Did Beis Shammai act in accordance with their opinion, which would seem to violate the commandment, do not cut yourselves into factions? The Gemara suggests, come in here. Although Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed with regard to several cases, nevertheless, they did not refrain from marrying women from each other's communities. The cases with regard to which they disagreed include rival wives and sisters, i.e. if two sisters had been married to two brothers and simultaneously became obligated in yibum, Beis Hillel prohibit both in yibum, and if they violated the prohibition and married regardless, they require a divorce. By contrast, Beis Shammai permit them to remain married. Furthermore, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel disagreed with regard to an outdated bill of divorce that had been written but not delivered. Beis Shammai maintained that if the husband and the wife continued to live together after the writing of a bill of divorce, that same bill of divorce can still be used later. Whereas Beis Hillel dispute this. Right? If a husband and wife say, that's it, we've had it, we're getting divorced, and they write the bill of divorce, but they don't hand it over and finish the divorce. Instead, they go back to being husband and wife. Then that paper is just sitting there waiting, and it could be used later to effect the divorce, according to Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel said, no, you drew up that bill of divorce, that get, to perform a divorce, you didn't use it, now that bill is null and void. If you ever want to get divorced again, you need a new get. And they likewise disagreed with regard to an uncertain married woman, i.e. whether a minor who is actually married and not merely betrothed may perform refusal of the husband. And they also disagreed with regard to one who divorces his wife and later she lodged with him at an inn, as to whether or not this is sufficient grounds for assuming that they remarried. You can get divorced and remarry, perfectly permissible, as long as in between you didn't go and sleep with other people. Additionally, they disagreed with regard to the issue of betrothal by money and with the equivalent value of money, and by a peruta or with the equivalent value of a peruta, like that's a penny. According to Beis Shammai, the minimal amount of money effective for betrothal is a dinar, or the equivalent of a dinar, whereas Beis Hillel maintained that even the less valuable peruta or its equivalent is sufficient. Meaning that when you perform betrothal, there has to be something called a kinyan. It's an action of acquisition, as it were. It's not that you're buying your wife for a penny, but rather that the action of exchanging something, handing over even something small like a penny, sort of announces to the world that this is in fact a betrothal. It's an action that is like signing a contract. And despite the fact that these halachos entail important ramifications depending on whether or not these women were married or fit for marriage, or whether their offspring are fit for marriage, nevertheless, Beis Hillel did not refrain from marrying women from Beis Hillel, nor did Beis Hillel refrain from marrying the women of Beis Shammai. And this serves to teach you that they practiced affection and camaraderie between them to fulfill that which is stated in Zechariah 8:19, love, truth, and peace. Rabbi Shimon says they did refrain in the certain cases, but they did not refrain in the uncertain cases. In other words, Beis Hillel were not worried that any ordinary woman from Beis Shammai might be one of those of uncertain status. And the Gemara infers from the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, granted, if you say that Beis Shammai did act in accordance with their own opinion, it is due to the reason that they refrained in the certain cases. However, if you say that they did not act in accordance with their opinion, why did they refrain from marriage? The Gemara replies, and how can you understand it that way, that Beis Shammai acted in accordance with their opinion? Even if they acted in accordance with their opinion, granted that Beis Hillel refrained from marrying into Beis Shammai, as those rival wives who entered into yibum are liable to receive kares and their children are mamzerim, according to the opinion of Beis Hillel. So you could see why Beis Hillel would refrain from marrying women from Beis Shammai. However, why would Beis Shammai refrain from marrying the offspring of rival wives of Beis Hillel? The parents are liable for violating a regular prohibition, and therefore their children are fit. And the Gemara answers, as Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said with regard to a different matter, this law was necessary not for the children of the rival wife, but only for the rival wife herself. Here too was necessary only for the rival wife herself. The law was not taught with regard to the children of the rival wives, rather is referring only to the rival wives. And that is where we leave off. Whew. We got through it. We did the whole daf. We're just a few lines from the bottom of 14b, but we've been running sort of further behind than that. And now we're just awaiting a day when there's 2 short dafs in a row so that we can actually get caught up onto the daf yomi schedule. All right, let me see if we have questions or comments. Okay, on Yevamos 14. Oh, thank you, Sharon Fran Brooks. I was saying at the beginning from the song Nachamu that we played of Shlomo Katz, I wasn't sure if it was Isaiah or Jeremiah. It's from Isaiah 40, verse 1, and is the first of the Haftarahs of consolation, which we count down, right, as after Tisha B'Av, right? After Tisha B'Av, then we start having the Haftarahs of consolation as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah and the cycle of holidays in the fall. Tom, could you go from Beis Din to Beis Din until you got the ruling you wanted? What if your disputant did the same? And the answer is no, you're not supposed to do that. If you go to a rabbi for a ruling, that's the ruling. And you're not supposed to keep shopping for a ruling after you've gotten the ruling. We'll come to that later in our Daf Yomi journey, but for sure that's the general principle, and you should not be forum shopping. Now, when they have 2 different courts, first of all, we don't have this division anymore, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, right? Since that ruling that came of the Bas Kol. But according to what we read here today, there might have been a time in history when you had 2 different systems of thought. You had to pick which one you went to, but then that's the ruling that you're left with. So you might have thought that on a certain matter, you might have a better outcome if you go to this court versus that court. But once you went there, that's it. That's the ruling you're going to get. Yosef Shum, would it be fair to say matters that result in chorus are the kinds of violations that are non-negotiable in any sense, including matters of unity? It's a little bit unclear. We would think, because there are certain matters, like if you violate Shabbos publicly, that actually is a death penalty offense at the hands of an earthly court. Not that it's ever been enforced. But a chorus penalty is usually an intentional violation of a negative commandment that's not as big as Shabbos. So then you get chorus. So I think you're right in the sense that these are bigger, clearer violations generally, but sometimes, it's more part of a hook, right? One of those laws that just because God said so, it's not really rationally clear. And the Torah actually specifies that soul shall be cut off from his people. Right, that is chorus. When you read in the Torah, somebody does something, that soul shall be cut off from his people. But the law that triggers that penalty isn't always so clear what the outcome would be. So I don't think it's really about clarity. It's about the kinds of laws that, this Torah says is a kares-bearing penalty, or is a situation for which the rabbis have derived it would be a kares-bearing penalty. Getting deeper than that is a little bit heavy-handed. A little bit beyond the scope of today. And Tom said, is kares excommunication? No, it's not excommunication, right? It's death at the hands of the heavenly court. What is death at the hands of the heavenly court? And, we covered that probably a year ago. But the sages absolutely disagreed on it. Does it mean that you're going to die younger than your time? Does it mean that you're going to die in your 50s? Does it mean, there were like 6 or 7 different interpretations of what is kares. And if you're Googling the question to learn more about it, you can Google it either as K-A-R-E-S, kares, more Ashkenaz pronunciation, or K-A-R-E-T, karet, kind of an Israeli Hebrew pronunciation. And then you can learn more about that. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Wonderful learning with you.